Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited today to welcome Denise Medeiros to talk to us about supporting international student success. Denise Medeiros is the Associate Director of the International Student and Scholar Office and has been at UNC Charlotte since November of 2002. She has previously worked with international students and scholars at Cornell University and at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She holds a Master of Arts in Education in Teaching English to Speakers and Other Languages, under Other Languages, which is TESOL, T-E-S-O-L, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies, and both from the State of the University of New York at Buffalo. Denise has lived in Finland and Germany and has taught English in Brazil. She has become fluent in Swedish, German, Portuguese, and Spanish, and we are so grateful that she is doing this presentation for us today. It is a very important topic. Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing your information and knowledge with us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jules, for the introduction, and welcome, everybody. I recognize some of your names and some of your faces. We're really thrilled to be able to offer this workshop for you this morning. It's the first time we've done it, and I've just finished building it based on a teaching guide that Jules and I worked on over the course of the pandemic. Like many of you, we have worked with international students for many years, and so there have always been struggles, there have always been successes, but there was something about this pandemic that just brought out new intensities, new anxieties and it was the pandemic, but it was the time leading up to the pandemic itself. And some of you may remember sort of what we've been living through for the last several years, and we'll go through all of this. So our office, the ISSO, helped them navigate a unique set of realities. So they had closed borders, they couldn't go home, right? Most students remained in the US and continued on with their studies, either 100% online or hybrid whenever possible. They also worried about the health of their families and friends at home. They were confused about travel restrictions, as were we. And sometimes hourly changes to immigration rules and interpretations and executive orders. So this brought their anxieties to new heights. They were isolated just like the rest of us, right? Maybe even more so. They experienced increasing financial insecurity as well as xenophobic incidents. So all of these things led to a lot of concern over their mental well-being and their ability to perform well academically, frankly. So because of these pandemic-related factors, international students were designated as a vulnerable population by the American College Health Association. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of that background as to what caused us to dig a little deeper into this and do a little more research and see what we could do to meet them where they were at, given the limitations, of course, that we all had. But the topic is also not limited to COVID-19 and to learning remotely. I think this is information that we have learned over many, many years. And so I thought it would be important to share it with all of you. And hopefully you can spread word to your colleagues as well. Okay, so the description, you've read the workshop description before you signed up. And so it is to explore the perspectives, expectations, and roles of the professor-international student relationship. And some learning objectives we have is for you to better understand the international student experience, to be able to identify predictable anxiety triggers, and to make some simple adaptations in order to further support international student success. I thought I'd give you an opportunity to type into the chat anything further that you hope to gain from the workshop. So maybe it is, the three things that I just noted, or maybe there are some other areas. So feel free to type those in the chat, and maybe we'll check back a little bit later. Otherwise, I think we will move forward. And what I wanted to start with is a little infographic that we have on our website of where our international students come from, who we are, and a little bit about that. So just so you know, this is our enrollment numbers for fall 2021. We're standing at about 1309 currently. Pre-pandemic, we were around 1700. So we're climbing back up there as our peers around the country. We have 95 countries represented, but you'll see that the huge majority of those are from India. Okay, and the huge majority of those are at the master's level. You see down at the bottom of the infographic our comparison of graduate to undergraduate numbers. Okay, so we're way heavier on the graduate than the undergraduate numbers. 1301 or 1031 for graduate, 278 for undergrad. Our office also serves visiting scholars and foreign faculty members. So we do a lot of the immigration. We also do programming, and we are also a referral service for international students. And you can visit this infographic lives on our website under the About Us section. On the next slide, we talk about there are the top colleges enrolling international students at the undergraduate level is engineering, business, and computing and informatics. The graduate level is computing, informatics, engineering, and then liberal arts and sciences with a high focus, high population in math, and then also business. And then here are the top fields of study, again, undergraduate, 96 in engineering, 56 in business and related, and 38 in liberal arts and sciences. And over on the graduate side, 538 in computing and informatics, 216 in engineering, and 116 in liberal arts and sciences. Okay. In terms of the top 10 countries represented, you will see, like I mentioned, India as our top by far. And I remember a time when I was here, I've been here 19 years. I remember a time where India and China were kind of neck and neck. And then that changed. And you know, international student enrollments do change they ebb and flow over the years due to global economies and a number of different things. But anyway, this is where we are right now. And I predict over the years, this will continue to change. Move my bar back down. Okay. So I want to, let me go back a little bit here. I can't. I want to go also just to make a disclaimer that international students are not a monolith, and I'm sure you all know this, right? Even though we have a huge population in some areas, what I'm going to talk to you about today is not necessarily true for all international students, but these are tendencies, and I'm talking about experience that we've had in working with a lot of majority countries, okay? Okay, so this slide is a snapshot from our international student survey that we did in spring of 2019. So we asked some questions trying to get at their highest level of concern. And if you remember what was happening in 2019, in the spring of 2019, it was the previous administration. There was a lot of campaigning going on. There were executive orders happening left and right. It was a pretty chaotic time. And so we listed all of these areas on the left of the screen here. And we asked them, which of these is of most concern to you? And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to put it out to you all today, and you tell us what you think, how you think they answered, okay? So you can see the percentages up along the left-hand column. And so our largest was hovering around 41%, all the way down to about 11%. So in no particular order, we have immigration concerns in general. We have English language ability, transportation, academic success, financial stability, travel and reentry. Of course, this is kind of linked to immigration, housing, medical care or bills, US politics, feeling connected, and I can't see the bottom one, cultural adaptation, and I believe English language is at the bottom, correct? Okay, so in the chat, why don't you put in your top 3? What do you think international students put as their top 3 highest levels of concern in spring of 2019? Okay, academic success, housing, medical care, English language, travel. Cultural adaptation, travel and reentry. Yep. Okay. Well, certainly they listed all of these as some level of concern, but the highest are as follows. So I'm going to click and it'll reveal the top, the areas. Okay. So number 1 are immigration concerns, coming in at 41.25%. And by the way, we had about 160 survey respondents at that time. Next is financial stability. Next after that is travel stress, which again, we kind of, in our world anyway, we link that under immigration, and we'll talk about this further. And then after that is academic success. Okay. Going down the line, affordable housing, medical care and bills. And then we drop down to 18% on the next one, which is US politics. And then transportation. As you know, a lot of international students don't have cars. Then we have cultural adaptation coming in at about 12%, followed by feeling connected, which is about 11%. And finally, English language concerns, also at about 11%, almost 12%. Okay, so I wanted to show you this so you can sort of see where their highest levels of concern are. And what I did when I saw this was realize there are 3 main areas that come together. And so in this slide, you see where they overlap. It's immigration, it's financial, and it's academic. And they all work together to sometimes fuel anxiety, or sometimes they are at the basis of some of the decisions that they're making or some of the behaviors that we're seeing. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is break it down, and we're going to go area by area to sort of see how they overlap and where their realities are. Okay, so starting with immigration concerns. Many of you probably know, if you work with international students or you're hearing, reminders coming out of the ISSO, is please make sure that they remain enrolled full-time at all times. So these international students come on F1 student visas. They come with strings attached. They come with expectations and regulations. So in order to maintain a valid F1 status in the United States, as you pursue your degree, you must be enrolled full-time every fall semester and every spring semester. Very few exceptions, and those exceptions need to be authorized by our office before they drop below full-time. Okay, so they are feeling this, they are learning this, they know this a lot of times before they get here, and if they don't, they learn it at our orientation. And then we bombard them with email campaigns and monitor what's going on. And we do our best to do outreach to academic advisors and students, so they know that this is their responsibility. Okay, so full-time enrollment and requirements are just a given, they're a requirement, and there's very little flexibility from an immigration perspective. Employment authorization restrictions. So international students are given this F1 visa in order for them to come and study and get their degree. Work comes second, right? It can never be first. It has to be, it has to complement any kind of studying that they're doing, okay? And so there are areas for employment authorization, and our office works with international students on a regular basis. We do lots and lots of workshops. We do lots of emails. Our website is full of instructions for them as to how and when they're going to be eligible to apply. But they can do internships under certain circumstances. They can work on campus without any kind of employment authorization. But off-campus work always has to be authorized by our office ahead of time. And there are lots of criteria and eligibility categories. And so it gets complicated. So this understandably is an area of concern for them. Travel and reentry. So anytime you are you're crossing a border, there are never any guarantees that there won't be any problems or questions or concerns. And so in general, this is always there's some level of stress when you're traveling around the world. That's another thing that our office is charged with is educating and assisting international students with these travel and reentry requirements. But certainly under the global pandemic, this was all changing very quickly. So that's why this travel and reentry became exacerbated during the pandemic. And applying for a new visa. Sometimes you get visas valid for many, many years. Sometimes it's fewer. This is based on reciprocal agreements between governments. And so sometimes students will travel and will not need to get a new visa to re-enter. Other times they will need to apply for a new visa to re-enter. So that's another set of concerns, documents, preparations, trips to the US consulate that might be in a different city where they're living. So those are some of the areas when we say immigration concerns, that's some of what we're talking about. Moving on to financial concerns, before, when the student applies for admission to UNC Charlotte, they go through an admissions process. That is based solely on academics because that's what it should be. And so once a student is academically admitted, that's when our office becomes involved and says, okay, in order for the US government, the immigration service, to allow us to issue you a document, you first need to show us how you're going to survive. How are you going to pay for your education? How are you going to pay tuition, fees, and living expenses, not to mention health insurance? Or if you're bringing family members with you, a spouse or children, you need to show additionally that you have money to cover them. You are not allowed to be a burden to US society, is from the government's perspective. So this is a non-immigrant visa. This F1 visa is non-immigrant. They need to always have the intention to return to their home country. They're not eligible for government benefits such as financial aid or food stamps or anything like that. So this is the sort of the foundation also of the F1 visa is show us that you have the money to come and live and survive, and we will happily issue you an immigration document called an I-20 that comes out of our office. And then they go and they apply for the F1 visa at the US consulate in their home country. A lot of times from our population, we see lots of students taking out loans at very high interest rates in order for them to be able to show us and the US consular officer that they do have the funds to survive. At what cost? We're talking about interest loans that sometimes they're floating, so they're not fixed. So it could be sometimes 3%, it could be 10%, it could be 13%. And so this is a source of stress for them, of course. And a lot of times, they live in large communities or in families where they pool money together. So you may have lots of different family members sort of contributing to the cause, so to speak, and in order to help for this student to be able to fulfill their dream and come to the US and get this degree and be successful. So sometimes they're putting their homes up as collateral. Sometimes it's their land or the farm. Sometimes it's their mother's jewelry or their sister's bank account or things like that. So it's very much a family decision for them. So this is sometimes what's happening underneath the surface that a lot of people don't know what's happening. They're also expected to pay out-of-state tuition. Okay, they don't benefit for that. They're not eligible for the in-state tuition simply because they're non-immigrants. They're not allowed to have the intention to remain in the United States indefinitely. So they're paying out-of-state tuition for full-time enrollment. And a lot of times they try to finish their degrees quickly, right? So they can reduce the number of semesters that they're paying this tuition. So at the master's level, we're seeing a lot of folks completing them in 2 semesters and a summer. Okay. Some of them do get stipends, I will say, and at the doctoral level, they sometimes get GASP awards. These do come with relatively low stipends when you look at the high cost of living, right? And this is increasing for them. So they're already living frugally, but they are sometimes struggling with keeping up with the high cost of living. We've already talked about immigration, and so they're carrying, this is a financial stress when they think about their future employability due to immigration restrictions. What kinds of jobs am I allowed to take? Will anyone hire me if they know I'm an international student that eventually will need sponsorship for an employment-based visa? They have some flexibility with their student visa after they graduate. They can have 12 months up to 36 months of employment authorization based on their student visa category. And that's another thing that our office helps them to navigate and get their application mailed to USCIS. Students in STEM fields can have up to 3 years of employment authorization post-completion. If they're not in a STEM field, they get 1 year. And then after that, it's up to the employers to decide, okay, do I have the resources to file an H-1B, visa, working visa for this person, or am I going to pass them up for someone who has permanent residence or citizenship, and I don't have to deal with that. So these things are always in the back of their minds as well. And you can see already where the financial overlaps with the immigration. Food insecurity. We know that lots of international students visit our food pantry. Whether that's because they are truly hungry or they're trying to save money, we're not sure, but we know that this is something that's happening. And then if they want to visit family or friends at home, these plane tickets are not cheap, right? So these are some of their financial concerns. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about immigration, we've talked a little bit about financial, and now I want to segue to our academic adjustment areas. So I guess I'll start by saying not all academic adjustment tips can be learned at an international student orientation or through the Writing Resource Center at a workshop, or the Center for Graduate Life and Learning, one of their fabulous workshops. These are all great starts, but it's just a start. It can take years to relearn how to be a successful student in a brand new academic environment. What was working for them at home might not work for them here, okay? For a number of reasons that even they don't understand. So it takes time for them to get it and for them to accept this and to accept the help that we have on campus and the resources, and then to learn it, right? How you can help, you can be aware of this. You can be encouraging, patient, flexible, wherever you can. And this can make all the difference. These students are motivated, right? They're motivated for multiple different reasons, like we mentioned already. but they're also academically motivated. They want to do well. And they do well academically in general. They score very high. These are some of the things that they articulated in the student survey. They have a desire for improved skills and practical experience. They know they need this practical experience and the improved skills. That's why US education continues to be so valuable despite everything that's happened in the world, despite all of our setbacks. They still come. They have a desire to graduate with honors, and they have a desire to have an accomplished career. They have a lot riding on this, but they do have these motivations. Some of these areas of academic adjustment are as follows, and I have some examples in each of these, under each of these bullets. So for many of them, this will be the first time not following a prescribed curriculum, and they're having to make independent decisions on academics. This is new for a lot of them. But they work in cohorts a lot of times, and they're told what to do and what classes to take, and all of that. So, so this has implications for a lot of help with making academic decisions and academic advising. I think about cultural values here because the US places a high cultural value on independence. And many of these students come from collectivist cultures where they are more dependent on their community, on their groups. These are support structures for them. So these students will often turn to one another rather than asking the professor for things like, what classes should I take? And so they're advising one another, especially at the graduate level. The community also helps them to navigate all of their new responsibilities in their personal lives as well. Buying groceries, cooking, doing laundry, paying rent and utilities. Sometimes when they're having a struggle or a conflict, they will very typically ask an intermediary to come in and ask questions on their behalf. We've seen this before. And this rubs against our cultural value of independence and directness. You know, we tend to say, be direct, talk to the person you're having a problem with. Don't talk to me about someone else. But it helps just to understand where they're coming from and that we really can't expect them to magically, immediately follow our values, our cultural values. Canvas might be new to them as well, just like it's new to, you know, domestic students in addition. But it helps to spend extra time making sure that they understand how to navigate Canvas, that they will be receiving updates, announcements, all the class materials. I know that you say that anyway, but it may be worth a little bit of repetition there, okay? Some of our survey responses support this first bullet. And they say things like, I'm having trouble adjusting to a new learning environment that requires lots of self-discipline. Okay, so self-discipline is tough sometimes. Another one said, understanding and meeting the degree requirements. Again, because they're being expected to know this stuff and to be a self-learner. Yeah, okay. And the second bullet talks about the importance of attendance, grades, frequent assignments, exams, and quizzes. So if you're familiar at all with educational systems in other cultures, a lot of times the assessments come at the end. And so the pace of the learning is much faster. And so sometimes they have a hard time keeping up with the pace. And really from the get-go, from the first day, it's bam, it's off to the races, and they're kind of not expecting it. So this can be a bit of a shock for them. The last bullet on this slide talks about academic writing. And so we may or may not understand this, but even writing has its own cultural values. Okay, I mentioned before that in the US, we are independent and we are direct. And it shows in our academic writing too, right? We're asked to be direct, to answer the questions. There's a predictable order, introduction and summaries at the end. And so this is not necessarily the case in their home cultures. Sometimes indirect writing is rewarded, and that's valued. So they may be a fantastic student in their home countries and they write papers that look a little bit like, one of these designs that goes around and around and around, and you're wondering, when are they going to get to the point? And they're writing correctly from their perspective, but in reality, that's not going to work for us, right? So luckily, we have fantastic campus partners on this who understand these things. The Writing Resources Center works with international students on a regular basis. The Center for Graduate Life and Learning has fabulous courses designed for graduate international students on writing, academic writing. Highly, highly recommend that you refer them wherever possible to some of these sources. Okay. Let me do one more slide talking about academic adjustment, and then we'll open it up for a couple of questions. That sound okay? Okay. Okay, so continuing on, a couple more areas of academic adjustment I wanted to bring to your attention is sort of this famous plagiarism, right? Academic integrity and plagiarism versus group work. Where are the boundaries? What's gray versus what's black and white? These lines can be blurred in many cultures. It may seem difficult to understand, but helping one another is often culturally expected. And even copying information from authoritative sources without citing is sometimes acceptable. So we go over this at the International Student Orientation, but that's just a blip in time, right? That's a few hours, a few days after they get off a plane. So this requires repetition and ongoing reminders. I'm sure that you all make your syllabus super clear about this, and you probably have lots of references on your grading policy. But this is one of those things that they may need more reminders on and repetition on, and just understanding that this is culturally flavored may help. We also have fabulous partners on our campus. So under the Dean of Students office, there is an office with a new name called Student Accountability and Conflict Resolution. And I put the names and websites of these partner offices at the end of the presentation. And I think you can get a copy of the presentation as well. Is that right, Jules? Or we can make that available so you can have the links at least. Okay, fantastic. So we regularly communicate and have meetings with Student Accountability and Conflict Resolution. They recognize there are lots of things at play. Students are not always necessarily trying to cheat. Maybe sometimes they are, but a lot of times we tend to believe that there's more going on than just that. Okay, it's really difficult. Class participation is the second bullet here. So for them to understand what class participation is and why is it being graded and how is it being graded? And does that mean that I have to speak? And what if people laugh at my English? There's a lot going on there. So I think understanding, being able to explain what exactly class participation means, and maybe you do this anyway, but knowing that this is also a foreign concept to them. Many cultures put a high value on absorbing and memorizing all knowledge from the professor. The professor is all-knowing. You all are on pedestals higher than we can imagine. An Indian student one time told me that there's some expression that sort of says God, professor, family, or something like that. So the professor or teacher is very close to God. And so they are used to just absorbing everything from what you say and not questioning and not talking and not bringing up questions. So this takes time. And for them to learn a less formal educational system can feel uncomfortable for them as well. So just so that you understand that, okay? And then the final bullet on this slide is referring to professors' expectations that students take charge of their learning by asking for help. And this kind of goes back to independent, acting independent and a high cultural value on being independent, and taking charge of your learning. But what does that really mean? Asking for help is hard, even in US culture, right? Sometimes it's seen as a sign of shame or weakness. So we have to constantly remind them that it's not, it's the opposite, right? It's a sign of strength, but it again, it's not going to happen overnight. And again, because they put that teacher, you all are on a high pedestal, to ask for help could be seen as an insult to their teaching. They might not want you to think that maybe you didn't explain it so well, and that's the reason why they're asking a question. Okay. Let's see, even sending emails, emails are tough because they are often not sure how to go about it. What is appropriate email etiquette? How do I, do I really just show up at office hours? So this is all kind of difficult. The other thing I'll say is the stages of cultural adjustment. There are lots of different sort of theories to this, but the first stage of cultural adjustment, at least with the model we use, is called the honeymoon phase. And in the honeymoon phase, no one wants to rock the boat, right? Everyone is happy to be here. This is their dream come true. They've worked so hard and for so long to get here that they're not really ready to start asking questions, even if they knew what their questions were. A lot of times this is when we see students nodding their heads in agreement, even if they have no idea what's being said to them. Right. And it's because they don't want to be seen as negative. They don't want to rock the boat. They're just happy to be here. So just try to take all that with a grain of salt, I'll say. Okay, let's take a minute and sort of feel free to unmute yourselves, or if Jules, you want to throw out some questions from the chat, I'm happy to go over what we've talked about so far. Now, just so you know, we have a couple more slides coming up talking about language barriers and some discussion questions and how you can show support. But anything so far?
Yeah, there are two really great questions here that I'd like to bring to the attention. One is, where is indirect writing style most prevalent in the world? Where do you see that with what students?
That is so interesting. I always remember my graduate work in TESOL, and we saw a sample of writing from the Middle East, and we saw a sample of writing from the US. And in the US, it was like an upside down triangle, right? And so we go from general to specific. That's how I was taught to write. General to specific, you get to your point. And in the Middle East was this, like, I forget the name of it. It's a swirl that starts big and it gets smaller, increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally in the middle, you get to your point. So that's my example is Middle East. Now, broad strokes. So I don't want to make any generalizations, and certainly Middle East is a region, not just one country or one culture, but that's one example.
Thank you. Another question, follow up to that is, can you give us some insight into which cultures have different plagiarism standards?
So,
and I do also want to while you're thinking about that really quickly, I want to point out to everyone in the chat that Olivia is faculty librarian who's just newly joined us. She's put in a resource about this as well, a LibGuide on this. So No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Denise. I just
Great.
wanted to point that out. So,
No
okay.
problem. And they can see that, they can grab that, that link if they want. Um, yeah. So my two examples are India and Colombia. Both cultures are collectivist. They're group oriented. The community is important, and even teachers know this. So the teachers know that the students are going to help one another. Now, I can't say that they condone, you know, copyright laws, but I think there is there's some flexibility, and I'm sure they put some boundaries around it that might look different than ours. So helping one another on a paper or on a project or even on a test is somewhat expected in at least those are two that I've worked with, that I've heard about. It's really hard. It's really hard. And our institution knows it. The ombudsman, the university ombuds, understands this and speaks to students at orientation. And when there is an international student in an academic integrity or plagiarism case, we are almost always consulted and brought in, and we would hope that the right questions would be asked, and that people would be honest in answering them. Okay. Anything else right now, or should we kind of move on? Okay, let's move on. Language barriers. So even though language ranked relatively low in the order of their highest concerns, it's still a concern, right? Always has been, always will be. That's not going away. And we can understand if it were us going to another country that maybe speaks another language or speaks a different version of our language, this would be tough for us too. So it's always going to be a concern. What I wanted to point out to you is that there are 4 skill areas of language learning. There are the passive skills, which are reading and writing, and then there are the active skills, which are listening and speaking. And so different cultures place different values on oral versus written. So that said, you may have folks from some cultures that are really strong in the passive skills, but struggle a little more in the active skills, and vice versa. And so that's that may not be a surprise. They probably recognize where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and a lot of times they are working on getting stronger in their weak areas. So what you can try to do is try to understand maybe where, if you have a couple in your classes, understanding where their struggles lie, you can help to create a strategy that leads them to academic success. You could also try to complement oral communication with written and vice versa. So for example, if everything you do is verbal, is spoken, and you're not really putting anything in writing, that might be something that might be able to help. Okay. The other area that you might want to monitor is your speed, how quickly you speak in class, and the use of US-based jargon and acronyms. Okay. And just try to be, just by being aware of it, you will sort of, sometimes you see like a blank stare in the room, right? Or you're just someone who is just looking, and it's clear to them that it's clear to you that they really didn't get what you just said. Just being aware is helpful. And then they're always curious to know what these things are, but try not to assume that everyone knows what these acronyms are or what this jargon is. Okay. Another area around language is thinking time. And so second language speakers need thinking time. Awkward silences during lectures might be uncomfortable, but they're necessary for cognitive processing. So just imagine that these folks are trying to translate words, concepts, and especially numbers. If anyone speaks a second language, you know how difficult it is to think of numbers and counting in a second language. It's so inherent in our primary, in our first language. So it can take up to a year to be able to really think in a second language. So one tip I say, and you may do this already because this is true for native English speakers, is to use the 10-second rule when waiting for answers to questions. So it could be that they don't know the answer, or it could be that they're just trying to formulate the words and put them into thoughts and get over their fears of opening their mouths and being ridiculed for their accents, or maybe they will make a mistake with their grammar. So as adult language learners, we are especially hard on ourselves for making mistakes. We don't want to make mistakes. We don't want people to make fun of us. We're very, very aware. So that just becomes amplified as adults. And then finally, timed tests and timed quizzes, just to understand that poor grades don't always mean that the students don't understand the material. Okay, it could be that they just needed more time to be able to get out or put on paper what they were thinking in their head. So wherever you have flexibility here, I say use it. You have some flexibility, some areas there. Okay, so now that we've examined the overlap of immigration, financial, and academic concerns, let's take a second to consider these questions. And so I put a couple questions here on the screen. How do you see these areas playing out in your classes? And what modifications do you think you could maybe make in order to better support international students? And you can either unmute yourselves or add to the chat. I'll pull up the chat too. Anyone have any, when I'm cultural?
So there is one, if I could offer one.
Sure.
I find that the international students I have in my class are not very participative in class. So what I've done is I've actually instituted discussions as a key part of the participation grade, because I find that they're much more willing to go to a Canvas discussion and express their views than to, raise their hands or to speak out in class. And I find that's working pretty well.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's less intimidating when you're in a small group than when you're in the large group. And if the teacher's not listening, right?
Well, the teacher is listening, but maybe not as directly and staring at them.
Right. That's fantastic. Thank you, Barbara. Does anyone else have any ideas or suggestions or thoughts?
I do have a question because I tend to have a mixture of international students and then native-born American students. And I do find that while the native-born American students don't answer every one of my questions, that they usually do before we hit 10 seconds. So I wonder about, classroom management, if there's a way of tamping down their participation, as odd as that sounds, to give international students an opportunity to speak as well. I don't know if any of y'all have any suggestions about that.
I'm gonna let someone else chime in. You all are really good resources for one another. Anyone have anything to Elizabeth's comment?
Hi, Elizabeth. I have some classes that when they were in person were often at least like 50% discussion based or student led. So one thing I actively did was try and give students time and see who all put their hands up, and then work my way around the room. So you're not just calling on the first hand up and the first person again and again. And, I wouldn't do this, the first couple weeks, but a little while into the semester, I would say to a student who is very proactive, just put your hand down. Let's see who else has something to say. And then, I'll allow students the opportunity to answer the same question. So a lot of my stuff is open-ended when we're looking at reading material. So it gives students the opportunity to have maybe multiple responses to the same question. So I don't know if your content lends itself to that, but that's been a good strategy to help me integrate more of the class.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, you all are really good resources for one another in this area. So that's super helpful. I'm remembering something I listened to whereby it was a US faculty member, and I believe it was a Japanese student who had a question but didn't want to raise her hand. So instead she made eye contact, and she was waiting for the professor to call on her, but she wouldn't raise her hand. So that's a really, really subtle thing that no one would think to do. But I offer that only because I listened to this podcast and by an international business professor who does some research in this area. And so, you may pay attention to body language or nonverbal communication, or, even ask them about it outside of class. Being proactive, I think, is also helpful, especially if you're concerned or you're not sure. Are my international students, do they understand or do they not understand? And waiting for them to come to office hours may or may not work out. So wherever you can be proactive to ask your questions one-on-one, you might be able to find out the answers to some of these things. Right?
I'd like to jump in for just 1 second.
Sure.
Something that we always promote at the Center for Teaching and Learning when we're talking about course development and course design is that at the beginning of each semester, you have a new set of students. And you're going to have some international students in there as well as, Native born American students. And getting to know your students is a good idea. And so we talk a lot about having a survey of some kind that is like one of the very first things that you send out to your students that asks them questions. And so one of the things you might want to do with reference to international students is, when we're thinking about creating your survey, you could put in questions about, how comfortable are you asking questions in class? How would you like to ask questions in class? Do you like to raise your hand, or like Denise said, eye contact? I know that in some cultures, direct eye contact with someone who is supposed to be superior, as Denise mentioned earlier, can be disrespectful. It can be a sign of disrespect. It sounds like in this situation, the student was trying to use it to get the attention of the person who had the higher status in the class based on their culture. And so maybe, thinking about including in those getting to know you questionnaires that we really do promote that you send out at the very beginning of your semester, finding out, how the student best needs help. When they need help, how do they best get help? Like, and if they want to ask questions, how do they prefer to ask questions? And then knowing that about your students. Now, the larger the class you have, obviously, the more difficult this becomes, but just having that data can be very helpful. Sometimes if you perhaps have a student who you see not speaking up or who is struggling, you can go back and look at their survey and see how they prefer to communicate with you and try to reach out to them through their preferred communication method.
Thank you, Jules. That's a great idea. And I would even wonder if maybe it's a beginning of semester survey. Maybe you give them some time to settle in, and then you ask those things also, because what's true in the beginning of the semester may not be true, towards the middle. And once they're sort of settling in, what do they need, right? I want to go to the next slide, where we're going to talk a little bit more about some very basic ways in which you can show support to international students. And I'm sure most of you, but by virtue of you being here, it shows that you already support them. But again, word of mouth also, and you can spread word to other faculty members. So there are some areas where you may not be able to help. You can't help them navigate their immigration status. That's our job. You can send them to us. You may not be able to help them financially unless you have, a great assistantship you want to give them. But you can help them feel welcome in class. And what that does is, for those 50 minutes or hour and a half or however long you have them, they put those worries aside, right? And so they're focused on being in class, and by simple gestures, they can really feel like they are welcome, not only in your class, on our campus. A lot of times I think our students feel like guests, and they don't necessarily feel like part of the Niner Nation or things like that. Again, because they take their studies so seriously, they're less likely, especially at the graduate level, to get involved in other non-academic things, such as clubs and sports and organizations. So what you can do, these are some ways that you can help them to feel really welcome, right? And don't downplay the importance of small investments that can really lead to their success. Smiling, right? Smiling and making them feel welcome. Learn to pronounce their names. And you don't have to be intimidated by it. Listen through the accent, right? And ask them to say their names, and you can ask them to say it 3 times, and each time you respond. And they say, oh, it's okay, you can call me so-and-so, and they make up an American name. I mean, you could do that, but what would it mean to them that you take the time and energy and maybe discomfort and vulnerability, you might make yourself a little vulnerable, by showing them the effort that it takes to learn their name, right? And maybe they ask them to write it out for you phonetically, if you're having a hard time hearing it. It speaks volumes when someone takes the time to actually learn to pronounce their name and to call them by their real name and not their American name. Unless they really, really, really want to be called by their American name, that's fine too. Be curious about them. Be curious about their cultures. Show empathy and understanding, and then connect them with resources wherever possible. And that's why I named some of those resources, and I have it in, not the next slide, the slide after that. Okay. Does anyone have anything else they want to add to this list? I'm doing the 10-second rule. It's hard. Okay.
There's a great comment here in the chat that I want to read out. It says, I asked my student to record her name 3 times on my phone so that I can learn the pronunciation. It was a fun activity for her and a way of learning for me. I think that's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, Susanna, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, we can do things now that we haven't done before, right? That's fantastic. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of, checking in with students and, being curious about them, especially with this, differing perspectives. So I was curious if you could give us any strategies on, what are good things to ask them without necessarily singling them out as different from rest of the class.
Okay. I guess this could be either individually or this can be as part of a class. I would say
Okay.
if it's part of a class and you're talking, whatever you're talking about, what do you teach?
American Studies classes about the US South.
Okay, wow. That's huge and that's really foreign to them. But maybe there's a concept there that would parallel in their home culture, right? Um, y- Sometimes it's touchy, right? And it's
Mhm.
sensitive. So depending on the topic, if it's sensitive in our culture, it might be sensitive to their culture. So asking them in front of the class might be uncomfortable. But I would say wherever possible, if you have a concept that applies that you're trying to talk about within US, you could ask if this is similar in their cultures, right?
Okay.
Or if you're not sure if they would feel on the spot, you could reach out to them ahead of time, either
Yeah.
by email or before class and say, how do you feel about me asking you about this?
Okay.
The other way I would say is be curious about them personally. And that's if they come to office hours or if you catch them in the hallway or whatever, ask them about their families. Ask them about what's happening in their country. What's the weather like where they're from? Things like that just show that you're thinking about them.
Okay, good. Yeah, in class discussions, I've had students sort of share the different family dynamics before when we cover relevant topics. So,
Okay. Yeah,
thanks.
good. Yeah, you're welcome.
Kind of a complement to that, or a different viewpoint, actually. In the chat right now, we have a comment saying to be sensitive, particularly to people with asylum or refugee status. They may
Yeah.
not want to speak to their stories about where they come from or their experiences. So
True.
something else to be thoughtful about. And then also another comment that sometimes I share a little bit of myself in class, and the result is that they will email me or stay after class to share or office hours. So sharing some of your own
Mhm.
stories as well too can sometimes
Yeah.
make that connection.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank you for speaking up, Susanna. Yeah, international students I've been working in the field of international education for 25 years, and that is in the non-immigrant world, which is very, very different than refugees and asylees and people who have had very different journeys. So that's I appreciate that. Absolutely. So one thing that we did recently is we had an international coffee hour a couple of weeks ago. If you didn't know, our office organizes an international coffee hour first and third Thursdays of every month, and we were able to bring it back for the first time since the pandemic a few weeks ago. And by the way, it's open to you all as well, faculty, staff, students, domestic and international. And so we decided just to survey them a little bit, very informally, and handed out little pieces of paper that says, what is one thing I wish my professors understood about international students? And so we handed them out little golf pencils, and a few of them turned some things in. So do you want to see what they said? Okay, so these are just a few things. And I think at our next coffee hour, we're going to ask, what are some things that my professors do that I appreciate? And so I'll send that all to, because I don't want this to seem like, it's only complaining or it's only bad. I did have one person actually say, when I tell my professor that I'm an international student, I get a lot of support. So that was one of the responses. And here are some other ones. One says, I need more time to write papers, complete homework and tests. Another one says, oh, my toolbar is covering that. We bring different ideas to the classroom, but we may not know how to express them correctly in English. A third one says, we might be feeling very lonely or isolated. I wish they would be more curious about our cultures. There it goes. I wish they would speak more slowly. I wish they would be more patient with international students. And then finally, many international students are not yet familiar with US culture. So sometimes they behave in a way that's not considered polite, which causes misunderstanding. So these are just a few pieces of feedback that we received recently from international students. Okay. Here are the resources I promised you. These are all hyperlinks to the ISSO, the Center for Teaching and Learning, and that teaching guide that, that Jules and I worked on together is called Supporting International Student Success, and that's posted there. And this workshop was meant to sort of complement the information there, so it's not completely the same, it's a little bit different. And there are some more sort of like tips and nuggets in that teaching guide. The Center for Graduate Life and Learning, they are a fabulous, fabulous partner for the ISSO and resource for international students on our campus, international grad students. The Writing Resources Center, Counseling and Psych Services, CAPS, right, our big, big friends there. And then Student Accountability and Conflict Resolution, where you have questions about sort of academic integrity and plagiarism and some of the other areas. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. Does anyone have anything else that they wanted to share or ask in the remaining minute or so?
Would you say that international students are taking advantage of counseling and psychological services?
That's an excellent question. I think that they are. I think that over the last several years, we've seen them participate more and more. And I think CAPS has done a lot more outreach as well. They participate in our orientation, the international student orientation that we hold every semester. And we try to push out programs and events and opportunities throughout the semester during our monthly newsletter. We try to remind them that reaching out for help is a sign of strength, and these are your resources and you're paying for your resources, so use your resources. But yeah, that's to answer your question, we have seen them going. It's still a stigma. It's a stigma within US culture as well. It's much larger stigma with some other cultures, but I think that they are that they're taking advantage of that more and more. Yeah, it's good to see.
Denise, is there a specific international students center, like the student union sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. No, not on our
Mhm.
campus, Barbara.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in the CHHS building on the second floor, and we occupy sort of a portion of the second floor. And so we have the study abroad office down the hall. We have the English Language Training Institute sort of over across the hall. And then we have a finance team. And so we're a comprehensive office. The ISSO falls within the Office of International Programs, which is comprehensive. But it's not like a house like on some campuses. I know like at Syracuse University, they used to be in an old house and they had a really nice lounge with a TV and you could watch, sports from different countries and things like that. So no, not on this campus.
Okay.
But I know the CGLL, when they opened their doors several years ago in the Cone Center, they tried to make it very sort of lounge-like. And so there are couches and tables and games and coffee machines and things like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you so much, Denise, for giving this presentation today. This is full of so much valuable information. We really appreciate you partnering with the Center for Teaching and Learning and developing and delivering this course and the teaching guide as well. I will send this presentation out to everyone who has attended today. And I'd like to wish everybody a wonderful, beautiful weekend.
Yes, fantastic. And thank you to everybody for joining us. And especially thank you for all you do to welcome and to support international students on our campus. Reach out to
Right.
our office anytime.